Imagine a job that requires you to travel a great distance and be away from home for long stretches of time. The job is demanding physically and mentally. You're in a shark tank filled with other hungry employees, all eager to grow their own names within the company so they can make more money. Your job requires you to be in good shape, so you have to find a gym, a tanning salon, and a laundry to take care of your daily needs wherever you are. I could be describing a lot of offshore professions, such as the oiling industry or the mining industry, but the description also applies to professional wrestling. In wrestling though, only the plane ticket gets provided. Car, hotel, food, gym, wrestling gear, boots, all comes directly out of the wrestler's own pocket. The business has always been this way, despite other professional sports bodies and entertainment industries paying all of these expenses for their talents. In wrestling, you are on your own. That's why it's no surprise wrestlers will look out for any opportunity to make life on the road a little more bearable. If you could fly to the next show and catch some sleep instead of driving down the interstate with your somas putting your left side to sleep, wouldn't you? Even before Vince McMahon invented the concept of globalized wrestling, the harsh traveling schedule of the business was well known, wrestlers being responsible for getting themselves hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles from one show to the next. This was a time before ride-sharing, GPS, and cell phones, so a journeyman wrestler on the road was limited in his or her, but let's face it, mostly his, travel options. The old saying goes that we are much more likely to perish in a car accident than in a plane crash. The data appears to back this up. While there is a 1 in 103 chance of dying in a car crash, there is only a 1 in 5 million chance of dying in a plane crash, according to the first two results on Google. Wrestlers spend up to 40 days on the road at a time without ever sleeping at home. Here's where I'm going with it. If you're a wrestler working the circuit, you're going to be traveling a lot. In 1975, less than 8 months apart, the wrestling world was shaken to the core by two separate yet equally devastating plane crashes. The ripple effect caused throughout the industry would have long-lasting implications. February 19, 1975. A troupe of wrestlers finished a show in Miami, Florida. They were due in Tampa the following day for the next show. Most of the wrestlers drove themselves from Miami to Tampa. Buddy Colt, a top heel in the Florida and Georgia territories at the time, was a licensed pilot and offered to fly a group that included the legendary manager Gary Hart, Bobby Shane, and Dennis McCord, who would go on to become Austin Idol, to Tampa in his single-engine Cessna. Gary Hart gives a fairly detailed account of the events in his autobiography. The foursome ate at Wolfie's restaurant before embarking on the flight and then set off. According to Hart, Buddy was flying the plane with Dennis next to him up front. Bobby Shane, who was about to take over booking duties from Bill Watts at the time, was seated behind Buddy, and Gary Hart behind Dennis. Reports relayed from Tampa forecasted terrible weather conditions, so Buddy made the decision to change course and land at Sarasota until the storms died down. As he was doing so, a message came in from the air traffic controller, assuring the former Marine that there would be plenty of time to beat the storm into Tampa. After putting it to a vote, the homesick wrestlers opted to press on to Tampa, secure in the assurance they had been given from air traffic control. However, once they reached a higher altitude and could see through the clouds, they found themselves smack in the middle of a massive storm in an aircraft woefully inadequate for those conditions. The air traffic controller had been wrong. The storm was making visibility a huge problem for Buddy Colt, who missed the runway on his first approach. Buddy attempted to swing around and make a second approach, but the storm was wreaking havoc, and in an instant they were hurtling towards the water at a bone-rattling speed. The next moment, the black choppy waters of the bay engulfed the wrestlers. Gary Hart had unlatched his seatbelt the second he realized something was wrong, and was thrown 300 yards away from the wreckage. He was severely injured, but lucid, as he swam towards the one source of light he could see through the rain. The first of his friends he came across was Austin Idol Dennis McCord. The former powerlifter had managed to use his brute strength to curl his seatbelt upwards and shimmy out underneath it, but he was badly injured. Gary Hart pulled Dennis with him towards the shore. Dennis's legs had been badly maimed in the crash. "Is anyone there?" Gary heard faintly. It was Buddy Colt. Leaving Dennis on shore, Hart swam in the direction of Buddy's voice. Buddy's leg had been wrapped up in the propeller and had almost been ripped completely off of his body. With Buddy and Dennis now accounted for, Gary realized that Bobby Shane was nowhere to be found. A longtime friend of Hart's, growing up together in Michigan, Bobby did not respond to any of their calls, and eventually Hart was forced to give up and try and get help for the remaining wrestlers. A naked, bloody, shivering Gary Hart banged on the door of a local home, knowing the sight of him would get the police called. When the news came down, Dick Murdoch arrived on the scene and jumped into the back of an ambulance with Hart, threatening a paramedic who tried to object. When Hart came to 3 days later, he was met with the tragic news that Bobby Shane had passed away, a promising future as a booker cut short. Gary Hart would never fully recover from the pain of Bobby's death, although he continued to have great success as a major name in the wrestling business. Buddy Colt left wrestling soon after, while Dennis McCord went on to become a huge star in the Memphis territory as Austin Idol. Legend has it that the WWF wanted to bring Idol in for a big money deal, but he turned it down knowing the air travel involved, as he no longer felt safe flying. As is often the case, reality is stranger than fiction in the professional wrestling world. The events on that stormy night over Tampa seem like they could be ripped straight out of an action movie. But just 8 months later, on October 4th, 1975, the wrestling world was shocked by a second deadly plane crash, another sobering reminder of the perils of the road. Several major players from Jim Crockett Promotions squeezed their way onto a twin-engine Cessna 310 at Charlotte, North Carolina. They were due for a short flight over to Wilmington, North Carolina to make an evening shot at the sold-out Legion Stadium. Johnny Valentine, father of the legendary Greg the Ham Valentine, sat next to the pilot. Valentine was then the US champion and a top draw for JCP. He was scheduled to be the next challenger for Dory Funk Jr.'s heavyweight championship. With him were Bob Bruggers, Mr. Wrestling 2 Tim Woods, and the legendary Ric Flair, who was a rookie at the time. Also on the flight was David Crockett, the operations manager at JCP Promotions and oldest son of Jim Crockett Sr. The pilot was 28-year-old Vietnam veteran Joseph Michael Farkas. Up in the air, Johnny noticed that the engine was out of fuel and joked to his fellow wrestlers about it, knowing that the second engine would keep them in the air. What he didn't realize, however, was that the second engine was empty too. Farkas had miscalculated the massive weight of all the wrestlers and was unable to take off with it all, so the decision was made to dump the fuel from the tank, which in theory would lighten the load. Due to the weight it was required to move, however, the tiny plane burned up its fuel much faster than expected. When Farkas switched over to the second engine, he knew the mistake he had made. No sooner had Johnny Valentine made his joke, and the plane dropped out of the sky. Remembering what Austin Idol had told him about the damage to his legs in the earlier crash, Tim Woods placed a heavy briefcase under his bare feet, as his shoes were too far away to put on in such a short time. Valentine tried to keep the others calm, saying he felt good and that they were all going to be fine as they plummeted towards the ground. Farkas valiantly tried to bring the engine's speed down, and by stalling the plane he did so, but they were still traveling an estimated 100 miles an hour when they hit the ground. David Crockett's head smashed through the seat in front of him. He had been apprehensive about the flight, and now his nightmare was coming true. Ric Flair, the 26-year-old newcomer, broke his back in 2 places. Bob Bruggers also broke his back. Sadly, Johnny Valentine's career in the ring ended instantly. A bone fracture wedged itself into his spinal column, briefly paralyzing him and beginning a downward spiral of poor health for the last 30 years of his life. David Crockett's mouth had been torn open and nerves were left completely exposed in his mouth, leaving him unable to eat, drink, or talk for a period. The pilot, Joseph Michael Farkas, died after an agonizing 2-month battle in the hospital. Bruggers had a steel rod inserted into his spinal column and was said to be in good enough shape for a return to wrestling if he so chose, but ultimately he never stepped in the ring again. As for Ric Flair, he went on to eventually return to the ring after an arduous physical rehab period during which he had to learn how to bump again, which led to the distinctive Ric Flair style we all know and love today except for Shane Douglas. The Nature Boy ultimately became the biggest star of his era, but the crash was always looming over the lives of all who were involved. These 2 tragedies are forever etched into the minds of wrestling fans. The gritty, tough, dirty nature of the wrestling business at the time was irreparably changed by the accidents. Ultimately, what we should always remember is the human cost of the business on its performers. The direct impacts like the physical toll are often remembered, but here in these examples the indirect risks, such as those posed by life on the road, are on display. These preventable accidents occurred in part due to the Wild West nature of the business at the time. 1975 was for professional wrestling the year where we question what might have been. Well, that does it for today, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like what you see, and I'll see you next time on Juice.